Francisco, it's Rex Broadcasting Wrestling Observer with Dave Meltzer and Bryan Alvarez.
Are you ready? Are you ready?
Let's get it on! Get it on!
How's it going, everybody? This is Dave Meltzer here with Bryan Alvarez, and we're going to be here for the next 2 hours talking pro wrestling. We're going to talk about all of the current news, as well as a lot of history, because our guest in the first hour is going to be SHAWN, ASSAEL, the author of the new book, Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, The Real Story of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation. We're going to talk to him about writing the book, about what's happened, because it's an entirely different business since that book was finished. That hasn't stopped the book from doing very, very well. It was number 48 of all the books, of all the millions of books, or a couple of million books, on the Amazon.com charts, and it was on the extended New York Times bestseller list, just having come out. We'll talk, and in fact, SHAWN ASSAEL will be going on a big tour starting first thing in the morning to publicize this book, so we can talk about publicity of the book. But if you got any questions...
We're back with Wrestling Observer Live. Give us a call anywhere in the U.S. toll-free at 1-866-OBSERVER. That's 1-866-627-3783. Once again, here's Dave Meltzer and Bryan Alvarez.
Okay, welcome back to the show. I'm Dave Meltzer, along with Bryan Alvarez. We're here 2 hours every Sunday night with Wrestling Observer Live, and our first hour guest will be SHAWN ASSAEL, author of Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, The Real Story of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation. Second hour, we're going to take open lines, so you can be ready with any topic that you want to discuss in the current wrestling scene. And in fact, as soon as we've got a full bank of calls, and we'll start getting the calls in a couple of minutes, but I want to get SHAWN ASSAEL on first. SHAWN, how are you feeling?
I'm great. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing really good. Hey, are you happy so far with the response to your book?
I'm just ecstatic. I mean, I had hoped it would get a little bit of notice. I'm not sure that I expected it would make the Times list in its second week out, so I'm just ecstatic. Now,
one of the things, your book is, I wrote a long review of it a couple of weeks ago.
An excellent review, by the way.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. But the two things about the book, number one, well, the one thing about the book, you're uncovering 20 years, basically, of professional wrestling. It is so much material. I mean, when I was reading your book, I was going like, man, it's, all the major stories are here, and all the twists and turns of, the promotional war here, but, God, there's just so much that you had to edit down into, the size of just a regular book.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the important thing, Dave, is to set out that I was pretty humble in sort of framing the story I wanted to tell. I didn't want to write an encyclopedic book. I just wanted to tell a story. And really what was guiding me was tell the story of how Vince got here from there. For somebody who maybe, a lot of parents who maybe are having their kids watch wrestling and vaguely know about it, but don't really know what's gone into the last, 10 or 15 years since they watched Hulk Hogan in Cyndi Lauper. To try to tell that story, to try to also, for, who remembered wrestling maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago, explain to them how it got here. So it was a pretty humble mission. It wasn't to tell, the whole story, just a good story.
And didn't it start out as just a book covering the Monday Night Wars?
Well, I mean, books are organic. They grow. Yeah, I mean, when I started in 1999, the Monday Night Wars were at a fevered pitch, and I very much had as a model a book that Bill Carter wrote called The Late Shift, which was the Leno Letterman Late Night Wars. So, yeah, it started out as that, and then it kind of grew because as I kept going back and back and back in time, I found so many compelling stories in the sort of early days of WCW when it was owned by the Crockett's, and even when it was, in the NWA years. And so I sort of expanded the growing on me and taking its own life.
One thing that I read in an interview that you did with Alex Marvez, when you actually went and visited Jim Crockett, and you talked to a lot of the major movers and shakers, Bill Watts, Jim Crockett, from the 80s period. But anyway, Jim Crockett has basically put wrestling out of his life.
Yeah, Dave, it was really very hard to get Jim. It was easier to get his brother David because his brother David is working still with Turner's organization. But Jim had, dropped off the face had dropped off the map, and he was such a pivotal figure. I mean, he was really a connective figure between the older days of the NWA in the South and then the Turner years. And I desperately wanted to get him. So one day, doing business for ESPN in Dallas, and I had heard that he was at a real estate company, and I just surprised him. I knocked on the door, and as he walked out into this anteroom to greet me, he almost looked around furtively like he was scared I would give away who he was. And it turned out he hadn't told a soul what he had done in his prior life. He had just completely left it behind, and all he was known in this Dallas office was as a real estate agent. I was floored at that.
You know, one thing, you brought up writing for ESPN and everything, and on the ESPN website, you wrote a couple of columns on steroids and wrestling, and you got a lot of response, and we haven't actually talked about this. But what, coming out of that, because that may end up being a big major budget, so to speak, for pro wrestling in the next couple of weeks, there are a lot of major league reporters working on the story, a lot of it because of the baseball thing, and the death of, say, maybe Davey Boy Smith and some other people, and one thing that I noticed from reading you did a column and then you did a column on your mailbag is how fervent the pro-steroid forces are that steroids are not dangerous at all.
I was stunned, Dave, and there was the sort of the typical hate mail that you get when anybody is really galvanized, and those are kind of the emails that are easier to dismiss. What was really staggering to me was the reasoned emails from a large segment of the population that seems to think that they're safe steroids or simply safe performance-enhancing drugs, since I think so many now would probably suggest that we're past steroids into a more sophisticated generation of drugs. But yeah, I mean, they were attacking me for being quote unquote naive or ignorant, or some were telling me I should go on it because there's so many wonderful effects, and I was staggered. And in the context of what I was writing about, I was simply saying that in baseball it's flat out cheating, and I was making that case. But they were trying to bring me in to show me that there is such a thing as safe steroids, and I couldn't get my mind around that.
And, here's the thing. It's a subject that not enough research has been done on. When you're young, you only feel the good effects, and the bad effects maybe when you get older. And as far as, is there a relatively safe dosage of this? I mean, perhaps there is. At the same time, when you have guys, and Bryan can talk about this as well, when you have guys who are on it 365 days a year, I don't know that that's safe.
Yeah, and I also think a lot of it is that it affects everybody in a different way. I mean, sure, there's probably guys that can use it every day their entire life and live to be 90. And there's probably guys that could go on it for 3 weeks and start falling apart immediately. So, I mean, just the thing, because I read this column too, and I've got, the same sort of emails. And to me, it's like,
that's right, I
don't think it's fair to say it's black or white. It's either one or the other. I mean, it's a shade of gray with that, just like anything else.
Well, that's right, Bryan. In fact, I remember when you wrote a similar column. I mean, you got similar type of emails as well from people who you cannot knock steroids to some people at all.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that though you can create some sort of moral equivalence here, and make some arguments that you don't have to necessarily back away from. The first one is that it's pro athletes are role models, and it all gets shoved down. I mean, if a rookie feels like he has to dope to keep up with a veteran, then a minor leaguer figures he has to dope in order to get to be a rookie, and a grade schooler figures he has to in order to get to the. So I mean, I think that you can say that baseball needs to get a grip on what it's doing, because the social impact of baseball players doping is immense. I hate to say it, but in wrestling, is the social impact as great? I think that by and large, the public doesn't care about wrestlers the way they care about baseball players. I think that's a tragedy. That's
kind of sad, though, because I mean, when I've talked to some reporters, and we start talking about, and they start actually investigating what's happened in wrestling. They'll sit there and go, I mean, if this was a real sport, oh my God. I mean, they'd shut it down.
Well, and that's absolutely a tragedy. I think that there's a difference between wrestlers doping and baseball play because of the number, the 365-day-a-year schedule that they run. They do so much more damage to their body because of the lifestyle, and that's why I think, Dave, have I read that you've suggested from time to time something like wrestling sabbaticals to let guys just get
downtime and tours? Yeah, I mean, I've written it. Other people have written it as well. The idea of when we get that from Japan, because in Japan what the guys do is they'll do a 2 or 3 week tour and they'll work real hard for those 3 weeks, and then they get 2 or 3 weeks off, and their bodies are hurting on those last week of the tour real bad, but they kind of can know, okay, when this week is over, I'm gonna lay in bed for a week and then I'll go back and train. And But I don't know that that's any...
I'm sure in America, with only 3 weeks off, I don't think anybody would come off anything.
Yeah, well, they're not going to come off, and they don't necessarily come off in Japan. And the other thing is that we've seen Japan as the model of that. The fact is the Japanese wrestlers, they get beat up even worse than our wrestlers. I mean, they're not getting any less injury. So I don't think that's... I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but it's not... I don't know that it's going to save anything.
Well, my suggestion in the ESPN was whether or not the premature deaths of wrestlers were going to be harbingers of what Major League Baseball players could expect, and I was beaten back by the readers saying that they really weren't analogous, that wrestlers live a much harder lifestyle.
Oh, they do.
But I still think that I would hope at least that for the baseball community it's a wake-up call.
Before we head to a break, I wanted to ask you, when your book was done, wrestling, I guess the last big story was Vince McMahon's move to the USA Network, or from the USA Network to TNN, and then the book was kind of over, and when we come back on the other side of the break, we're going to talk about the fact that so much has happened in pro wrestling between the XFL and the folding of WCW and the folding of ECW since the book was originally done, and talk about, that aspect of just how wrestling has changed. We'll be back with more right after this. You're listening to the Wrestling Observer Live on the Sports Byline USA radio network.
Wrestling Observer Live. Email the show now or anytime at WOL@WrestlingObserver.com. That's WOL@WrestlingObserver.com. Now back to Dave Meltzer and Bryan Alvarez.
Okay, welcome back to the show. I'm Dave Meltzer, editor of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, with Bryan Alvarez of Figure 4 Weekly. We're here for 2 hours every Sunday night with Wrestling Observer Live. And I want to remind everyone, if you're interested in the most detailed news on professional wrestling, we cram... Actually, it's like some weeks about the size of half of a book. And that's not an exaggeration. The Wrestling Observer comes out every week, and it's got all the news from the world in detail, and a large percentage, I think, of the listeners of this show are avid readers of The Observer. You can go to WrestlingObserver.com and just click on the thing that says Wrestling Observer. And, in fact, there's a preview up on the website. And Figure 4 Weekly, which Bryan does, which tremendous comedy writing on professional wrestling and basically all the news as well. You can go up to WrestlingObserver.com, and there's information on Figure 4 Weekly as well. And since we're on that subject, we've got SHAWN, ASSAEL, the author of Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, The Real Story of Vince McMahon and the Wrestling Federation, which just came out about 2 weeks ago. It's already on the extended New York Times bestseller list. It's way up top the Amazon charts. It is the most successful book that I'm aware of on professional by the World Wrestling Federation, and I'm somewhat envious of that because I wrote a book that... was not nearly as successful, but that's another story.
No, and it should be, and it is very successful. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Tributes was something that I kept by my side while I was writing, and it's doing quite nicely on Amazon too. I want to congratulate you for that book.
Well, thanks very much, Sean. Real quick, let everyone know how you get the book, and I know that you're going on tour first thing tomorrow morning, I guess, to promote it.
I'm going to do I think 30 drive time radio stations in 3 hours.
Oh my God!
But it's a lot of fun. Yeah, the book is on Amazon. It's on BarnesandNoble.com as well, and it should be in bookstores everywhere. There's been a huge rash of it. It's not in your bookstore. Just be patient. It's coming.
Real quick, before we get back to the subject that we were talking about, how much did Mike Mooneyham, who's a good friend of mine, how much did Mike Mooneyham have to do with the book?
Oh my gosh, I don't know where to start. I mean, the book would not have its level of savvy or detail if not for Mike. I mean, I came to Mike when I was not quite halfway done with it, knowing that I just wouldn't be able to finish it on my own. It was just too time intensive. And Mike was just the saving grace of this book. I mean, he filled in so many blanks. He told me so many stories. He wrote some beautiful passages. He's done some of the best writing of his career in this book, and people have said that we're a perfect tag team to him, and I'll agree with that. I really do. Mike, there's so much for responsibility for making this book as lively and vivid as it is, and as insider and smart as it is.
Last 2 years or so, when you pretty much were done with the book, and then everything has changed. Now, was your original title going to be the story of Vince McMahon, or was you were going to have a story more of like a Vince McMahon Ted Turner war, and then there was no Ted Turner?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I really don't. This is my second book, and both times I really didn't bother with the title until the whole book was done. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly Ted started out being, I suppose, an even character in the book with Vince, but Ted was never nearly as hands-on with the company as Vince wrestling. So the book is not technically a biography of Vince McMahon. It's really a story of how he came to monopolize the industry, and Ted has a fairly large role in the telling that story.
When we go back to the 80s, and I've thought about this a lot, because, living through the changes in wrestling in the 80s from the old territorial system, and a lot of people have some very wonderful memories of it, and I do as well, but it changed. And I don't know, it's a real interesting question. In fact, I discussed this question with Vince McMahon a couple times. We had some arguments about it in the past, on whether or not, and this would be, say, 1991-ish, where I can remember very fervently a long argument over an hour that Vince McMahon and I had over whether or not Vince McMahon was good for professional wrestling. And when it was over, I don't know that either of us really had an answer, because he changed wrestling, but would it have been better or worse without him? And now, 10 years later...
Curiosity, what were each of you arguing?
Well,
was it like Vince saying he was and you saying he wasn't, or?
It was a lot more complicated than that. I mean, it was just more about, with the territories and everything, and was wrestling really bigger because, less people had jobs. But Vince would say, but the ones who have jobs are making more money, and, we get these, big crowds. But then again, you're only getting shows a certain number of times a year when you used to get it weekly, and his TV ratings were nothing compared to what they are now, or what they or certainly what they were a couple of years ago. But that was the type of stuff that we were arguing. It wasn't really, it wasn't like a heated argument. It was just a long discussion over, exactly what had happened in those previous 7 years, and now it's been 10 years later, and I am not sure that if it had not been for Vince McMahon, that if there would even be professional wrestling today, or maybe I don't want to say it would have been bigger, because I cannot imagine the other promoters, ever making it as big as it was a couple of years ago as McMahon and Bischoff as well. With that really hot period. But when we look back, Sean, last 2 years, really hot period. Now we're in a real back. What would be the story from the outside that you would tell over the last couple of years, and also what are your thoughts as far as you go back to when Vince Georgia Championship Wrestling in '84, when he decided to go national? What do you think the industry would be like today, or would there be an industry?
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed. I went to a place called the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. I think it's in Newton, Iowa, and they had films from the turn of the century with matches in New York City that just had the city, buzzing. I mean, if in 1900 wrestling was big, it was, I think, proportionately as big in 2000, and I think that it's going to be as big in 3000. I mean, I just think that wrestling is a staple of guy culture and always will be. What's happened with Vince in the last couple of years is he simply fed wrestling into the vertically integrated television food chain that starts with Nickelodeon, works its way up to MTV, and the WWF fits somewhere in there. And it's simply become a much more of a consumer, television product, a consumer mainstream television product. Were it to be back in the regional promotions, were it to be on local television more, it would just be different, but it would not be. I mean, this is simply a different kind of wrestling. Vince has brought it much more into sort of the reality television, where you have these sort of strands of fact woven into fiction. In the book, I trace that back to his interview with Melanie Pillman hours after her husband died, and I write, the question Vince asked wasn't really what a wrestler would do. It was more like, what would Primetime Live or Dateline do? And I say that was easy, put the widow on the tube. And I write in that chapter, and it's really one of a couple of codas in the book, that wrestling was crossing a very shaky bridge, and I think that now it's fully crossed that bridge, where you see it now with Bischoff coming back, where there's this final synthesis of fact and fiction into an interesting amalgam. I think that it's bigger in some ways. I think it's smaller in other ways. It's as diverse. I don't think it's as interesting, but it certainly is being fed into the vertically integrated food chain over at Viacom, and that's perhaps the story of the last couple of years, as well as Vince going public. And you can argue it's the final death of kayfabe now that it's a public company focused on short-term profits, and you can also argue that he's, robbing himself of some script originality because he has to focus on those short-term profits. And I think you could also argue, as we do towards the end of the book, that he became a mark for his own corporate ambitions. There was a time when the WWF was so top-heavy with management and vice president types and, people who had worked at Pepsi and Coke and all these other companies, but I think a lot got lost, and Vince had to clean house back to his roots. I'm not sure he's back to his roots yet, but I think, he's getting there.
What do you say, or what do you from the outside looking in, and I don't know how much of this you're going to have to answer and how much the media that talks to you is going to be savvy on this, but as far as, in a sense, I don't want to say a collapse, but certainly a collapse of WWF profitability. It went from being exceedingly profitable to being a company that's going to be, unless things change very quickly, a money-losing company.
Yeah, I was actually, I was jarred by, in your current issue of The Observer, your phenomenal reporting on it, that if not for the Parents Television Council settlement of $3.5 million, which was revenues, it would have been the first money-losing quarter since 1997. So
for pure wrestling, he actually lost. There was a money-losing quarter with the XFL, but that's different.
Forgive me. No, I should have said that. Right.
Yeah.
Look, this is a boutique stock. I don't think any of the big mutual funds were getting into this stock because they thought it was going to be a mega mover. I'm not sure, because it was a private company before, how he managed the books. I don't think that this is a disaster. I think that we've seen a ceiling in his television ratings in the cable universe that he operates in. It hasn't gone below a 2.9. It's gone up to a 4.2, I think. He's doing well. I mean, he's still, I think you could rightfully say, the king of cable. I guess your figures this week show pay-per-view revenues down 22%, house shows off. That'll spark. It's a really volatile business plan he's got. I don't think he's on the ropes by any stretch. I just think he needs some new talent. He needs some new storylines, and he needs some good TV people around him. And I think that's another sort of code.
Sean, we got to hit you a break. Hey. Yep. All right, you're listening to the Wrestling Observer live on the Sports Byline USA Radio Network.
You don't know what you don't belong.
We're back with Wrestling Observer Live. Give us a call anywhere in the U.S. toll-free at 1-866-OBSERVER. That's 627-3783. Once again, here's Dave Meltzer and Bryan Alvarez.
Okay, welcome back to Wrestling Observer Live. I'm Dave Meltzer, editor of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, with Bryan Alvarez of Figure 4 Weekly. We're here for 2 hours every Sunday night. Our guest is SHAWN ASSAEL. For the first hour, the author of Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, The Real Story of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation, just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's doing very well, and it's basically a story of the last 20 years of professional wrestling and all of the changes in the business. It's a different product, it's a totally different system, and the TV is incredibly different. It's changed and reinvented itself many times, and one of the big... maybe even the biggest period in the history of wrestling, at least in this country, I would say would be probably 1996 through 1999. It was Vince McMahon was down, WCW run by Eric Bischoff was down, and on Monday night it became the thing when they were going head to head. It was a incredible period of wrestling, and one thing that I will remember is in the middle of all this. And a lot of wrestlers were, complaining. I remember in WCW, and this was during a period where, and they were sowing the seeds of their demise. Don't get me wrong, but I just remember they were all making money, and Eric Bischoff was saying to a lot of the guys, many of whom are out of work, that you will go back in your lives and you will look at this as the highlight of your life, and so don't complain about it, basically. And the funny thing is that in a lot of people who are complaining, that probably is true. They're going to remember that period as the big period. Now, Eric Bischoff, to me, I have always credited Eric Bischoff as the one who really got this thing going, because wrestling was down and out, And, boy, when Nitro, you had a great story, I remember, Eric Bischoff going to the meeting. In fact, you should talk about Eric Bischoff going to the meeting with Ted Turner and really how Nitro was born and going head-to-head with Raw and forcing this, both companies to really, then, it became, live every week, then 2 hours every week. Wow, there was 5 hours of wrestling on Monday nights that Bryan and I were watching religiously, and then it collapsed. Sean, really quick, what was the birth of Nitro about?
Well, I mean, Eric Bischoff had come to a meeting with Ted Turner, expecting to sell him on a deal to beam the satellite to China, and then that's the deal he thought he was going to talk to Ted about. And then Ted asks him, he says, why aren't we doing better against Vince? This is when it was just on Saturday nights. And Bischoff, who had been invited to the meeting by a more senior executive, he describes it. He says that he couldn't stop the words from leaving his mouth, but he blurted out, "Because I don't know." And the room fell silent. These more senior executives around him just felt, "Oh my God, the guy sandbagged us." But Turner, turned to one of his aides and said, "Well, then give the man Monday nights." And Bischoff talks about leaving that room and saying, "Be careful what you wish for, because you might get it." And after that, a few months later in September, it went on the air.
What would you describe as, I look back at Bischoff, and now Eric Bischoff's back in the news again, because he's in a real surreal world, as the general manager of Raw and everything like that. But it's made me reflect back on Eric Bischoff, who did all of these crazy things, and a lot of them worked, and a lot of ballsy moves and all that. And then at the other end, he completely when it was over, WCW is no more. So was it good for the business in the long run? I guess it was bad for the business.
Yeah, I think you have to say it was bad for the business in the long run. You want to have, a little bit more critical mass than you have now. I think what happened with Eric is, and to some extent, Vince started it when he brought Tyson in, and then, began to hype the music and try to diversify a little bit, is that Eric thought that he could go Hollywood, and it wasn't necessarily a terrible idea if done in moderation. He thought, but he started, having lunches at the Beverly Wilshire with Gene Simmons, striking these incredible deals that could only...
Incredibly stupid deals.
Well, Gene Simmons played Eric in Smartest Man in Rock and Roll, and you have these scenes in the book where you can imagine Eric, he's been playing with a house's money for so long that he's going to Hollywood with Turner's wallet, and everybody sees him as a mark, and he marked out in Hollywood. There's a scene in the book where they're doing the accounting for WCW, and an accountant's sure he's got it wrong. He does his numbers 4 or 5 times, and he realizes, my God, they're hemorrhaging money. They won't make it, the next month. And a file goes down to, corporate, and it's called the Holy Bleep file, and that's when they realized that they had to pull the plug.
I remember warning, Bryan and I both warned them about that. Actually, the funniest part of that was it was so well. They did a run of about 23 straight sellouts. I think this was in early 1998.
98, yeah.
Yeah, and it couldn't have been better. Vince was starting to catch. I think that Vince was catching up in the ratings. I don't remember who was ahead, but I remember that they sold out 23 straight house shows. Their business they were averaging 10,000 fans per show. And I was sitting there going this is the beginning of the end. And people in the company that I was talking to thought, you couldn't be more foolish, you couldn't be more wrong. But all of the, we both saw it, we both talked about it at the time. All the seeds were there. They were not building the future, and this is a business where if you don't build the future, boy, it goes down, and it goes down fast. And WWE, perfect example. It went down so fast. It's staggering.
Yeah, and I think that Eric, really was looking for one quick fix after another. The best things about him, I think, is he could be a really inspiring leader, and I think that he was a really good television guy. And I think that's the other sort of subtextual message that I learned in reporting this book. Vince was always at his when he had the best television people around him. One of the most unsung heroes in the book was this woman, Bonnie Hammer, who was an executive at USA. She had done Sesame Street and public service documentaries before she went to work for Vince at the behest of USA. And she just made him make great TV. I mean, she introduced hot moments, she introduced great casting and pacing, but we love it when we see. Eric was like that at a time with WCW. He was just a really good TV guy, but I think he grew too fast into something he wasn't, and then the TV just got harder and harder to watch until the end. I was very nearly watchable.
Yeah, well, they had that whole 1999 was an absolute disaster.
But I guess my larger point though is that good wrestling on TV needs good TV people around it, not just good wrestling people.
One of the things, and it's funny because it was Eric Bischoff's success as a character that caused Vince McMahon to become a character, and Vince McMahon became as successful as Eric Bischoff was. Vince McMahon was a phenomenal character.
Yeah.
But it also turned into the curse. Bischoff, when you're trying to be a character, you're thinking about what's my character going to do, and you start forgetting about the big picture. And the same thing happened with Vince, in that he was worried about his lines and he was worried about where his character was going, and a lot of the other things, kind of fell apart. And I think that with Stephanie, it's the same thing, and it's like it's the curse of. We saw it with all of the old territories. When you had Dusty Rhodes, prime example. When the booker or the writer is also the main television character, it becomes kind of an ego thing, and in the long run, it's always been a killer.
Dave, I'm about to say what I'm about to say with total trepidation, because I don't think I should ever disagree with you with anything.
Certainly can.
Only slightly. I put Vince on an entirely different level as I do Eric, or even Dusty when he was running himself through the ground with the Dusty finishes, and certainly he's not on the level with either Stephanie or Shane. He's an honest-to-goodness television natural. Bonnie Hammer, when she came to work for him, looked him in the eye and said, Vince, and this was before Stone Cold had caught on, she said, Vince, you're your own best character. And for years, he, and you know this better than anybody, Dave, didn't want to upstage his acts. He thought that he belonged in the background, to the extent that even in the early days, he would dig trenches, so he wouldn't over shorter acts, and he would make them look bigger.
Right.
He's a natural on TV, and over the last 20 years, he's built a connection with his audience. Frankly, I think there's not enough of him on TV.
I can't agree with that. Well, right now he's kind of taking himself off for a little while, but
nobody can play a better Vince McMahon.
Nobody ever. No.
Right, and that's right, Brian, and that's where I think Eric fell short. Once Vince got goaded, both by Eric and the people at USA, to come out on stage, he was so electric that people say that the Steve Austin character was Vince. He was so electric that he could pull it off. Eric couldn't, and that's when their roles switched, and Eric began to really fall victim to the old wrestling adage. He believed his act.
Anyway, Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, we're here at Wrestling Observer Live. We're going to get to the callers. We're going to start with Gene in Stamford, Connecticut. Gene, what's going on?
Yes, I'd like to talk to you about how wrestlers are viewed these days versus we go back 5-10 years ago. Since they came out and said publicly now that it's sports entertainment, there's no question as, is it fake, is it real? I think these gentlemen are getting a lot more respect now, at least for what they do physically in the ring and even the drama they possess, the acting skills, versus years and years ago there was the sentiment that, is it real, is it fake? They're just getting a lot more respect, at the very least physically, for what they do now because of this.
I think that's right. I got asked when I've been doing some publicity on this book, what happened when they declared that this was fake in testimony before the New Jersey Senate. And a lot of the old-timers thought it would be the death knell for wrestling, but paradoxically it wasn't, because it allowed them to start building on real characters. You started to see Scott Hall's called Scott Hall, and you started to see a lot of these guys get known iconically, not for their characters but for themselves. And then you started to see the athleticism come up. And now, people ask, well, is it a sport? No, but they're athletes. They may not be engaging in a sport, but they're athletes engaging in some exciting athleticism. And so I think that I think it's actually been good for wrestling, although nobody at the time knew it.
I think one of the problems though is they expose it too much. much on TV. I mean, when you're off TV, if you're doing an interview somewhere, if you're writing about it or whatever, it's great to explain that, hey, this is just sports entertainment. You know, if you're doing an interview with the media or whatever, if Rock's on the Tonight Show. But I think when people sit down to watch the shows, they want to believe. So I think it's a huge mistake to go on TV and do these little things that just expose it as everybody's friends and, you know, whatever.
So shows like Confidential.
Not so much Confidential, but I think about something this week where, you know, they cut backstage at SmackDown and the baby faces and the heels are all there together hanging out and talking. I mean,
like after it went back on the air for the first time.
That was different. That was a special show, but I mean, like when Eric came out, or they'll show those crowd scenes, and I think people don't want to think that everybody's sitting there friends backstage, even though deep down they know it. I don't think they want to be slapped in the face with it in the body of the show. Anyway, we have got to head to a break. We've got just a couple more minutes left with SHAWN ASSAEL.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, you're very welcome, Gene. You're listening to the Wrestling Observer Live on the Sports Byline USA Radio Network.
Big John McCarthy of the UFC, and you're listening to the Wrestling Observer with Dave Meltzer and Bryan Alvarez.
The Wrestling Observer Live. I'm Dave Meltzer, editor of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, with Bryan Alvarez of Figure 4 Weekly. We're here for 2 hours every Sunday night. Our guest, SHAWN ASSAEL, author of Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, the real story of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation. We've only got SHAWN for a couple of minutes left. I want to know what your thoughts are. Ever since Eric Bischoff came into WWE just a couple weeks ago, seems it's been quite a change. But one of the things that Vince McMahon seems to have been obsessed with, and Brian Gewirtz, is using Eric Bischoff to rewrite history to their version of history. You know, such as that he stole, you know, like Hulk Hogan during the trial. He stole all these guys during the trial. It was during the trial, you know, when Vince was, you know, had his mind occupied on keeping his freedom. You know, made all their big moves when in fact all those moves were made years later.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And you know, just, you know, even having Eric Bischoff actually do an interview in the ring, that lengthy interview the first night in, doing basically the Vince McMahon version of wrestling. It's almost like, it's almost like, you know, Vince McMahon is using his television to, you know, to do his legacy. And I mean, he's done that many times when ratings are down or he has that big 20 speech. It seems like to me Vince McMahon at his age is trying to, you know, kind of rewrite history.
You know, David, you asked me some of the reasons for the book earlier. Maybe the big to put between two covers something that approximates a reasonable truth about where he's been and where he's going. And we know that he's going to write his autobiography one day, and we hope it'll be truthful, but we can't
it won't be.
That.
Can't be.
And we can't count on
help himself.
And so, in the course of interviewing 300 people and reading your Observer religiously, we hope we've created something that Vince can't run from, and let him try to recreate his legacy. But hopefully, we've done something that'll give you the real story of how he came to take over wrestling.
SHAWN, I want to thank you very much. The book Sex, Lies, and Headlocks is available at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble of your bookstores. It's doing very, very well, and good luck on your book tour. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's a very interesting read. I would say it's a better book for people who are not wrestling historians and general public wanting to kind of get an overview of what's happened in the last 20 years of wrestling. To get it, I think a lot of historians will know a lot of the stuff, but for those of you on the outside, it's a great synopsis, and it's going to be the mainstream history book on this business, I think. Anyway, we will be back. SHAWN, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you too, Dave, and Bryan too.
Okay, we'll be back with our second hour. We've got a full bank of phone calls, and we'll start hitting those phone calls right after this. You're listening to the Wrestling Observer Live on the Sports Byline USA Radio Network.